I want to welcome everybody to the Sunday morning at the virtual Marxist Library. My name is Eugene Ruyle, and I'm one of a small group of volunteers that puts this program on. So my job is to keep the schedule, do the mailings, and make the coffee. And I have my coffee. I don't know if anybody else has theirs, but that's now your problem. Okay, and as most of you know, today is the 26th of July, and we honor the 26th of July movement and the Cuban Revolution, because it was just 67 years ago today, I believe, that a young Cuban doctor saw that his society was sick and that he decided to attack the Monaco barracks in Santiago, Cuba, I think, and then for which he was thrown in jail for 15 years, but he got out and continued the revolution, and 2 years later marched into Havana and began this world historic revolution. And we had scheduled Tony Ryan to speak today on Cuba, since he's been to Cuba about 1,000 times and is expert on the topic, but unfortunately we had to rearrange the schedule, and since I foolishly had put myself in, I'm going to speak not on the Cuban Revolution, but on the revolutionary process in general. So let me see. So, and I want to go back here to the Cuban Revolution. Tony's been there a lot. I've been there once for the 150th anniversary of the Communist Manifesto. And as part of that, I came across this phrase when a North American participant asked the host, saying, well, how can you call yourself a democracy when you only have one political party? And the response here, I think, was very classic. Under Batista, we had 7 political parties and no democracy. Now we have one political democracy, one political party, and we have democracy. And there's a whole worldview that's embodied in that statement. And it's that worldview that I think we need to, that I want to talk about today. So, that being said, let me get started on this. And again, I haven't tried to make anything I'm saying palatable or politically correct, as they say. So I'm hoping that most of my statements you will disagree with probably in the first 5 minutes. But I will ask you to allow me to finish, and by the end you will be even more pissed off. So I hope we have a good discussion. Okay, so the topic is socialism, communism, democracy, and dictatorship, a scientific perspective. And the write-up here says that too many leftists and socialists remain wedded to a bourgeois ideology and therefore cannot understand the world we live in, much less change it. ICSS Member Eugene Ruyle will clarify issues such as the nature of scientific socialism, the class nature, let's see, it's kind of hidden over here, but class nature of the state, the distinction between bourgeois and proletarian democracy, and the role of the proletariat, of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the transition from capitalism to communism. Come prepared with questions to challenge the speaker and defend your own views. Okay, with that, we'll skip over that. And we're in very serious times because as Wall Street's think tank, as our comrade Larry Shoup calls it, for this first time in modern history, we have a communist country poised to be the biggest and most important driver of the global free world. That's astonishing. And what's even more worrisome is that we still don't know what makes China's political leadership and Xi Jinping in particular tick. If that freaks you out, and it should, Liz Economy's book, The Third Revolution, is the place to start. And of course, Liz Economy is one of the China specialists in the Council on Foreign Relations. But I would just like to submit that he diagnoses the problem well, but his solution is, I don't agree with. We don't need more bourgeois social science to deal with it. We need proletarian social science, and that's found in Marxism, Leninism, and scientific socialism. And okay, so what I want to do is I've divided my talk into four parts. I forget how many parts. Anyway, the first part is what is scientific socialism? The second part, we will be looking at, we'll be focusing primarily on China because that's been a topic for much discussion recently. So that we'll move to look at China. And as an anthropologist, again, I'm not into bourgeois social science. I'm into anthropology. And we anthropologists look at the world somewhat differently, at least I do, than bourgeois science does. And so I'll be looking for, one of the things we always ask, well, you may or may not know that Marx, after he finished volume 1 of Capital, left the rest, other 2 volumes or 3 volumes to Engels to finish. And he turned to an intensive study of anthropology, particularly the work of Lewis Henry Morgan. And Morgan is important because he dealt with anthropology as the study of humanity as a whole, not just the present and its development, but also the future. And he argued quite clearly that a mere property career is not the final destiny of mankind. So that's one thing we need to adopt a native's point of view and say, well, how do they view them? What do they think they're doing? It may not be the same as what we think they're doing. And secondly, we need to have this same global perspective and say, well, how does this particular society fit into the global sweep of humanity from earliest times to the present? And then we'll be reviewing this and see what kinds of conclusions we have. So, if we're going to talk about a scientific perspective, then part of me originally says, well, we should look at, T.S. Kuhn and scientific revolutions. We should falsify Karl Popper's work and do some other stuff with these Western philosophers about science. But I decided to take a more Asian approach and quote this fellow Lu Xun, sometimes called the greatest writer Asia has produced in the 20th century. Mao was very admiring of him. He also, the Communist Party sees him as, in some senses, the father of the of communism in China, although he never joined the Communist Party of China. But he was honored by the Communist Party, and his statement was, lies that are written in ink cannot erase facts written in blood. And I think when we look at Asia or the world in general, I think we need to bear this in mind, that there's a lot of what we now call fake news, all this weird kind of ideas about that. But whatever's written in ink or posted on Facebook, they cannot erase the lies that are written in blood. And whose blood are we talking about, or whose blood was he talking about? Well, the blood of the Chinese people, when with the Opium Wars and the imposition of the unequal treaties on China, and the wars in which the Chinese people attempted to liberate themselves and finally did in the 1949 revolution. So again, we need to look at this reality there because we know that there's a lot of nonsense that has been written about this. And how do we approach this from a scientific perspective? We need to have this humanistic approach aspect in which we identify with the people who have been oppressed and who are writing history in their blood. But we also need to understand this in scientific perspective, and two old Chinese sayings I think are relevant here. First of all, seek truth from facts. This is usually, well, it's one of Mao's favorite statements. We need to have facts, not lies. We need to gather facts and study them empirically. This is the basis of the scientific method. And the second was cross the river by feeling the stones. That is to say, very carefully and understanding each step of the crossage. These two statements, I think, are very important. The latter was usually attributed to Deng Xiaoping, but it is said to be an old Chinese saying, so I will go with that. And I also want to just, again, repeat what I said before, the why anthropology, and partly because I decided to study anthropology when I was a graduate student, but also because Marx spent so much time, his mature years, studying anthropology. So we need to adopt, we need to replace the Eurocentric perspective of academic social science, economics, political science, with the anthropological perspective of looking at society in its own terms and understanding how, quote, the natives view themselves. And secondly, we need to adopt this anthropological perspective. So let me see, did I want to go here yet? I did. Okay, well, I want to say when we do this, again, when we look at scientific socialism, you know, Marx developed scientific socialism in opposition to the socialism of his day, which he called utopian socialism. And I diagrammed the utopian view, the American concept of socialism, in which everybody thinks, well, socialism is a great idea if only other people would go along with it. That is to say, if everybody adopted our view, then we could accomplish a lot. But this is essentially a utopian view that says, well, it's socialism an idea that we need to make reality conform to. And that's diametrically opposed to Marx's view and to Leninist views. And I've diagrammed that view here, in which socialism is a phase in the revolutionary transition from capitalism to communism. It's a global process, and one that exists independently of our knowledge or thinking about it. I wouldn't properly say independently of, because this movement creates the theory, not vice versa. So we begin with capitalism, we have a revolutionary overthrow of that system, and we get not an ideal perfect society, we have socialism, which has defects. And we have the dictatorship of the proletariat. And then that proceeds into communism over a long historical period of class struggle. So I'm kind of taking my time here. Be sure to, I have less than an hour, so please keep me honest here. Okay, so that's how Marx viewed it. And again, Marx, in his letter to Wiedermeyer, says, I didn't discover the class struggle that was already seen. What I did was show that the class struggle is tied into particular periods in the development of production, and that the class struggle leads inevitably to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then that's only a prelude to the abolition of classes and a classless society, namely communism. So Marx sees this as a historical process. And of course, Marx said that this had to be studied scientifically. And he did do a very scientific investigation of the Paris Commune, but that wasn't really a socialist revolution. It was a working class revolution, one that Marx properly honored. And people frequently look at this and say, well, yeah, look at the Paris Commune. There was democratic elections. They selected their leaders. They could get rid of them automatically, immediately. No one was paid more than a worker's wage and so forth. And that's the way the dictatorship should be, of the proletariat should be run. Lenin did not agree because he noted that, well, what's the key thing about the Paris Commune? It was overthrown within 3 months. And Lenin said, a revolution is worth nothing unless it can defend itself. And the first function of the dictatorship was to defend itself from imperialist intervention and overthrow. He went on to say that dictatorship is not like a Tea Party. It's a most determined and most ruthless war waged by the new class against a more powerful enemy, the bourgeoisie, whose resistance is increased tenfold by its overthrow. The dictatorship of the proletariat is a stubborn struggle, bloody and bloodless, violent and peaceful, military and economic, educational and administrative, against the forces and traditions of the old society. And he goes on to say, that there's no one form. Just like bourgeois states are varied in form, from the royal family, the Queen of England, to Parliament in France, to our two-party system, but their essence is all the same. All these states, whatever their form, in the final analysis, are inevitably the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The transition from capitalism to communism is certainly bound to yield an important abundance and variety of political forms, but the essence will inevitably be the same, the dictatorship of the proletariat. And as we have seen, we take as our model, of course, the Soviet Union, but in the 20th century, but in the 21st century, we've seen a tremendous abundance of political forms. Their essence is all the same, but their form is different. And this concept is broad enough to understand the dictatorship of the proletariat in Cuba, in Vietnam, in China, North Korea, Laos. These are all different forms of the same thing. So we can have our favorite among these, of course, but we have to remember that they vary. But he goes on to say that this dictatorship is going to last a long time. And this is what he said in 1919 to students at Smirnov University. We shall use this machine, or bludgeon, that's how he described the dictatorship of the proletariat, to destroy all exploitation. And when the possibility of exploitation no longer exists anywhere in the world, when there are no longer owners of land and owners of factories, and when there is no longer a situation in which some gorge while others starve, only when the possibility of this no longer exists shall we consign this machine to the scrap heap. Then there will be no state and no exploitation. Such is the view of the Communist Party. So Lenin is pretty unequivocal, one might even say dogmatic on this point. But then we need to continue that after the failure of the German Revolution of 1918, and after seeing the harsh conditions under which the class struggle was waged in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s, during the Civil War and after, many liberal supporters of the October Revolution became discouraged and accordingly became, quote, democratic socialists, Trotskyists, or even worse. Okay, when we look at this, I think it's also important to say that socialism has evolved over time. It's not the same in the 21st century as it was back in the 19th century. So we need to understand this development in three phases. First of all, the 19th century saw, first of all, the transition from utopian socialism to scientific socialism. We saw the revolution of 1848, 1871, the Paris Commune. We saw the development of labor unions, which were against the law in the early 19th century. Saw the development of a powerful political party. So that lasted from the 1820s to the 1914. And then we saw the 20th century. Basically that ended when the Social Democratic Party failed to stop World War II. Then we had the 20th century, which I see as going through two phases. The first is socialism in one country, saw the historic defeat of fascism, and the spread of socialism to where it became a worldwide phenomenon globally. And it over half, as much as 2/3 of humanity lived in societies that were consciously trying to build socialism, or socialism was the dominant area of resistance. And so socialism was a huge success in the 20th century because it dramatically improved the well-being of our species. And we'll have statistics or studies on that. But then this very success frightened the bourgeois to the extent that the empire struck back from 1991 to 1993, 1989, overthrowing in Poland, elsewhere. We all know that story, and we don't need to go into it at that great depth. But socialism, although it was declared to be dead, and many people thought it was dead, we listened to Margaret Thatcher saying there is no alternative. We were at the end of history. And this was accepted even by many Marxists or former Marxists. Many of us did not, but our voices were very weak. But then, and I stuck my guns back then, many others did, but I came up with the formulation basically that has guided my own thought for the last 30 years, that Marx was right in the 19th century, Lenin was right in the 20th century, and that our task in the 21st century is to do for Marxism-Leninism what Lenin did for Marxism. He transformed it into a viable weapon in the struggle for socialism. And that's what we see in the 21st century, particularly, well, in all the countries, Cuba, as well as China. So I will skip over a further discussion of that. But now in the 21st century, we have the socialist bloc survivors, Cuba, China, Vietnam, Laos, and North Korea. And then we have the others, so-called democratic socialism here in the United States, which we've talked about before, and the Bolivarian Revolution and other revolutions around the world. They're all the socialist bloc survivors are all countries that have had revolutions. and many Marxist Chinese make this distinction between before and after October, because the party plays a different role after it has seized state power and established the dictatorship of the proletariat than it does before the revolution, because it could only take a critical role at that point. So with that background, let me go forward and first of all, look at these two perspectives, anthropological perspectives on socialism with the Chinese perspective, with characteristics for a new era. And first, we're going to look at the natives' point of view. And the best place to look for this is the Constitution of the People's Republic of China. Many people think constitutions have no role. They're just there for show. But as we know, particularly from the studies of Charles Beard, the economic interpretation of the US Constitution, the constitutions were there to reflect the viewpoint and the needs of the ruling class at that time. And in the American Constitution, it was the slave owners, stock owners, rich merchants. The Constitution was written to support them. So that's important to understand. It reflects certain class views. And secondly, it is a real document that, we know the power of the people in the streets, but the Constitution, the legal system, and all this and the electoral system does have a powerful impact. And the same is true of China. And the Chinese Revolution was written to represent the views of the ruling Communist Party and the workers and peasants of China. And it begins with a brief discussion of the achievements of Chinese civilization and how China was reduced to semi-feudal, semi-colonial status by European imperialism before the liberation of 1949. And then it goes on to say the following: the People's Republic of China is a socialist state under the people's democratic dictatorship, led by the working class and based on the alliance of workers and peasants, which is in essence the dictatorship of the proletariat. And this is hardcore Leninism. This is the same as Lenin put into the Soviet Constitution, first in 1918, the Russian Federated Socialist Republic, and then also in the 1924 Constitution. So again, if we want to look at it from their point of view, they are hardcore Leninists, and they go on to say this a little bit farther down: under the leadership of the Communist Party of China and the guidance of Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, the important thought of three represents in the scientific outlook on development, and the Deng Xiaoping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. The Chinese people of all nationalities will continue to adhere to the people's democratic dictatorship and the socialist road, and to turn China into a socialist country. So this is basically hardcore Leninism. The Constitution of the Communist Party, again, says that this, which I don't have here, but it says, the goal of the party is communism. So this is all hardcore Leninism adapted to Chinese situations. But they go on and say some things that are not in our Constitution. The future of China is closely linked with that of the whole world. China adheres to an independent foreign policy and strives to safeguard world peace and promote the cause of human progress. Now, last time I looked at the American Constitution, there's nothing in there about world peace. Further, the Constitution of the PRC guarantees essentially the same rights as those guaranteed in most bourgeois democracies: the right to vote, the freedom of speech, freedom of the press. And it's worthwhile to note the Constitution of the PRC, as other socialist states all have equal rights clauses, which U.S. has yet to pass the ERA. Women in the People's Republic of China enjoy equal rights with men in all spheres of life. So that's in the Constitution. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so again, this is all hardcore Leninism that is embodied in the Constitution of China. And again, the question is not whether it conforms to our utopian conceptions that we have here in the United States about, oh, well, China's not socialist because I think socialism should be X, Y, or Z. That's not what they're concerned about. It's not whether it conforms to our ideals and our utopian plans, but rather does it conform to the Marxist-Leninist view of socialism. So I went over these diagrams again because I think they're important. We need to bear them in mind. And let's see here. Okay, so that's what they say. And everybody will say, oh yeah, they say they're socialists. We know that they're not socialists. You know, they're an authoritarian state. They're a totalitarian state. They don't have any freedom, et cetera, et cetera. So first of all, I have a section here, why China is indeed socialist. And this is inspired by some of our discussions here at the library. First of all, China is socialist, part one. The People's Republic of China is the product of one of the world historic socialist revolutions of the 20th century, starting with the October Revolution of 1917, continuing with the Chinese Revolution of 1949, the Cuban Revolution of 1959, and the Vietnamese Revolution of 1945 to 49, each of which exhibited their own distinctive characteristics. And in the case of the Chinese Revolution, it went through a new democratic phase from 1949 to 54, in which they formed a Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which continues to be a vital institution in the governance of the PRC, and the land reform, which abolished the landlord class, the marriage law, which established equal rights for women, it established healthcare, developed educational programs, it got rid of syphilis, opium addiction. You know, there were dramatic changes. It took 5 years before the revolution could lay the basis for a socialist society. And by 1953, the material basis for socialism was laid, and the PRC wrote its first constitution, held its first elections, which have been held every 2 years from 1945. And there are 2 plenary sessions annually of the organizations that make up the national level, the National People's Congress and the National Committee of the Chinese People's Consultative Contest, which has, I think, 7 or 8 political parties which are members and entitled to run candidates. And for those of you who haven't been looking through the little red book lately, here's Mao Zedong casting his vote in 1953, I believe. And again, you'll note from this picture of Mao there that he has Chinese characteristics. Already, when you look at Mao's work, you see socialism with Chinese characteristics. So again, I think that's a very important thing about the political process. And so again on this, China, not India, is the world's largest democracy. With a population of 1.4 billion, it has regular elections every year, just like Cuba. The Cubans say, before the revolution, we had 7 political parties. Now we have 1 and we have democracy. I would say the same is true of Cuba. And I think arguably our democracy, or the Chinese democracy, is probably the most effective in the world. And if we want to argue that point later on, we can compare Xi Jinping versus Trump in the United States, Modi in India, and Boris Johnson in the UK. Okay, second point, why China is socialist. Since 1949, the basic economic development of China is socialist, not capitalist, as defined by Stalin in 1951. And he talks about this as in the foundation, or problems of social, I forget what the title is. But he gives the basic law of capitalism, which we know basically the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, there's devastation. We can see that going on around the global system. And Mao said, and Stalin says, is there a basic economic law of socialism? Yes, there is. And he said the essential features and requirements of the basic law of socialism might be formulated roughly in this way. The securing of the maximum satisfaction of the constantly raising material and cultural requirements of the whole of society through the continuous expansion and perfection of socialist production on the basis of higher techniques. Consequently, instead of maximum profits, maximum satisfaction of the material and cultural requirements of society. Instead of the development of production with breaks in continuity from boom to crisis and from crisis to boom, unbroken expansion of production, instead of periodic breaks in technical development, accompanied by the destruction of the productive forces of society, which we see in capitalism, an unbroken process of perfecting production on the basis of higher techniques. And we can see this if you look at the history of China since 1949, a steadily growth in the economic and cultural well-being of the people. So we can merely say that the elimination of poverty, which lifted 800 million people out of poverty from 1980 to 1949. And by 2020, there's said to be less than 1% remained in extreme poverty. But this is not the first time. About people say, well, this is the first time this has ever been done. No, if you look back at the Soviet Union in the 1930s, you will see another process, comparable and perhaps an even more impressive one. So that the gains began in 1949 and steadily improved throughout the Mao years and into the Deng Xiaoping years. And this is not idle claim. The facts support this. We should, learn truth from facts. Well, in this case, I guess we have to go to the New York Times, but they're not a hostile source. If anything, they're not a sympathetic force. They're not a mouthpiece for the People's Republic. They're hostile to the Chinese people, as we know, and the Chinese communism. But he said, here's from the New York Times, the date, I forget. But they say, imagine you have to make a bet. There are 2 18-year-olds, one in China, the other in the United States, both poor and short on prospects. You have to pick which one has the better chance of upward mobility. Not long ago, their answer would have been simple, the American dream. After all, that's what America is all about. But the answer today is startling. This is the New York Times editorial, not an editorial, but their editorial comment. China has risen so quickly that your chances of improving your condition in life there are vastly exceed those in the United States. And they have the chart there that shows how production is developed in China, the red line, and then at the bottom, the United States. And again, these are percentage increases. So the United States began much higher than the Chinese did. But you'll see that for most of the American people, there have not been significant gains. And for the poorest people in the United States, the poorest half of society, there have been no gains. And as Bernie Sanders always tells us, all the increases in production over the past 30 years have gone to the top 1%. When you look at China, again, you see the top 1% did very well, but the dramatic improvement of 4/5 of the Chinese people have seen their position in life quadruple. And this is a close up here. And in the United States, you see incomes for the poorest Americans have fell, whereas even the poorest Chinese people saw their incomes increase by 200%. So again, this is the operation of what Stalin called the fundamental law of development. Here's another statement by Eric X. Lee, who I believe appears quite a bit on YouTube. In 1949, when Mao took power, average life expectancy was 41 years old. Literacy rate was below 15%. Electricity availability, 0 outside a few cities. By 1979, before Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, literacy rate was in the 80s, which means 100% of young people. Electricity coverage was almost everywhere, even in the poorest areas. So you had a population being rapidly educated and were curious, energetic. And then the economic reforms released those energies. And here's another article in Monthly Review about Chinese economic growth. According to the official statistics, since the Bureau of Statistics was established in 1952, it was very difficult. The difficulty of producing statistics are tremendous, as we all know. From 1952 up to today, the growth rate of China's GDP averaged 8.3% annually from 1952 to 2015, with a strong 6.3% between 1952 and 1979. That's while you had the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, which are said to be disasters, but the economy continued to grow. It was the development strategy of the revolution that set the conditions for the current economic success. And this success has been a continuity of the past rather than a contradiction. And again, these are not things that most of us read very carefully, but I think we need to pay attention to the whole truth. We seek truth from facts, and these are facts. And then again, did Mao really kill millions in the Great Leap Forward? And they say this idea has been used as a springboard for to rubbish everything the Chinese people have achieved. However, it's simply not true. Life expectancy increased by approximately 1.5 years per calendar year since the start of communist rule in 1949. Life expectancy increased from 35 years to 65 years in the 1970s. So that's a dramatic year. Basically, Mao gave people another, 30 years of life. So it's absurd to claim that life expectancy could have increased by so much during Mao's years with no increase in living standards, and some other things must have been going on during the Cultural Revolution. So let me just go on. And the other thing I want to stress is, again, China is Socialist, Part 4. All serious analysts agree that the Communist Party of China is the ruling party of the People's Republic, and that there is a direct, unbroken line from Lenin to Stalin to Mao to Deng Xiaoping and on to Xi Jinping. To be sure, there were divisions within the international communist movement, but the Khrushchev-Brezhnev-Gorbachev line ended with its overthrow in the Bush-Yeltsin coup of 1919. The Chinese Communist Party has never been overthrown, as happened in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And despite its turbulent history since 1949, such challenges by Lin Biao, the Gang of Four, Zhao Ziyang, and Bo Xi Li in 2020, the Chinese, there's been continuity. These have all been struggles within the party, no overthrow of the party. And so we need to bear that in mind, the lineal descent from Lenin through Stalin, Mao, and Xi Jinping. That's why I call him my comrade. Okay, and a lot of people say, oh, well, there's capitalism in China. You can't be a socialist. Here's what Mao said about state capitalism. He wrote this in 1953. The present-day capitalist economy in China is a capitalist society which for the most part is under the control of the people's government and which is linked with the state-owned socialist economy in various forms and supervised by the workers. It is not an ordinary, but a particular kind of capitalist economy, namely a state capitalist economy of a new type. It exists not chiefly to make profits for the capitalists, but to meet the needs of the people and the state. True, a share of the profits produced by the workers goes to the capitalists, but that is only a small part, about 1/4 of the total. The remaining 3/4 are produced for the workers in the form of a welfare fund, for the state in the form of income tax, or for the expanding productive capacity, a small part of which produces profits for the capitalists. Therefore, the state capitalist economy of a new type takes on a socialist character to a very great extent and benefits the workers and the state. And I don't have specific statistics on this. As I said before, I'm not a statistician, but if you look back at the study by the New York Times, this is in fact true. Whatever kind of economy exists in China, it has benefited the overwhelming majority of the workers. Okay, let's go on. Why China is socialist, part 6, support by the workers and peasants. Now, a lot of people say, oh, they have labor unions, but they're not real labor unions. We got labor unions here. They're not independent. They're products of the state. Well, let's take Chinese versus US labor relations as an example of how we have to look at a society in its own terms. The American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the AFL-CIO, has 12 million members. And hasn't done real well by its workers, as we all know. The All China Federation of Trade Unions, the ACFTU, has 3.2 million members, making it the largest trade union organization in the world, and I would argue also the most. It
was 302 million.
Pardon?
It was 302 million on the slide.
Did I not say that?
You said 3.2 million.
I apologize. Thank you for reading the slide and not listening to me.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay. Now, in the United States, we have to understand what's going on in China. We need to abandon Eurocentrism of bourgeois social science and adopt an anthropological perspective. In bourgeois democracy, such as the United States, trade unions developed as society industrialized. In the 1820s and 30s, workers organized to defend their interests, both in terms of wages and working conditions, from exploitation by homegrown capitalists. The police, as well as the state and federal government, served the capitalists and repressed unions. In this situation, labor unions had to be independent, both from the capitalists and the state. By contrast, in China, the All China Federation of Trade Unions, now the largest trade union federation in the world, was organized in 1926 to fight against foreign capitalists while China was still a semi-colonial country. Consequently, it was anti-imperialist from the start, with close ties to the Chinese Communist Party, which was formed in 1921. And when, after many struggles, and won't go into those, but in 1949, when the CCP overthrew imperialism, gained state power, the ACFTU rose with it and became, in the words of our comrade Wadia Halabi, his well-chosen words, it was a union that had risen to state power. As such, it had to be involved in running the economy for the benefit of all Chinese, not just its own workers. It had to serve the interests and well-being of all the workers of China, not just its own workers. So, and this was similar to what happened in the Soviet Union, and was reflected in the trade union debate between Lenin and Trotsky, which I think we need to bear in mind. They're very relevant here. And the Chinese have studied that. People say, oh, well, they don't understand what happened in the Soviet Union. They do understand it. But this does not mean that the ACFTU does not serve its members. For in fact, it benefits the working class far better than the unions in bourgeois societies. So for example, while we complain about the anti-union policies of Walmart, China has the only unionized Walmart in the world because the Chinese Communist Party decided to unionize it in 2006. So they just told Walmart, unionize. And when thousands of crane operators in the Shenzhen port terminals went on strike, this was kind of like a wildcat strike, shutting down one of the world's busiest ports, the Shenzhen Federation of Trade Unions sent officials who settled the strike within hours, resulting in a significant victory for Chinese workers in their struggle against the sweatshop exploitation in the export-oriented industry. So again, they intervened here. And here's Min-Chi Lee, China and the 21st Century Crisis, which many of you probably know. At a time when large parts of the world are suffering under the austerity of neoliberal austerity, China may be the only large country where the working class is making significant gains in their struggle against capitalist exploitation. So I think we have to say, then we have to ask question, well, the independent trade unions. Well, then we have to go back and ask this question, because yes, China does not allow independent trade unions, and perhaps if this were an ideal world, they should. But China does not exist in the real world. In the real world, China has been dominated by US imperialism since the 1830s. And Mao alluded to this in a 1949 speech, where he said, China continues to be threatened by US imperialism, and it's understandable that the CCP would refuse to allow independent centers to develop anywhere. They have learned the lesson of solidarity in Poland, which, interestingly enough, seized power in, or at least won an election in 1989, simultaneously, the same day as the Tiananmen uprising, counter-revolutionary uprising in China. So we need to understand that there are reasons why they don't allow independent things. They've learned the lessons of history. Meanwhile, we have to question how independent U.S. Trade unions, in fact, are, given the Taft-Hartley Act, their connections with the CIA, and their failure to protect workers in the United States from the neoliberal assault, also their activities around the world, which has led some people on the left to call it the AFL-CIA. So we'll pass on there. Okay, people say, oh, well, China's an imperialist country, look at Africa. Well, Africans know what imperialism is, and China is not that. China has never enslaved a single African, nor has it shed a single drop of blood for oil. And in the African case, some people said, oh, well, back during the Tang Dynasty, there were black slaves from Africa during the Tang Dynasty, 1,000 years ago. That's true. Nor have they shed a single drop of blood for oil. Well, they did get into some squabbles with Vietnam over territory, not oil, and with sailors in the South China Sea. But that was not over oil, that was over fishing rights. And trade routes in the South China Sea, despite what Pompeo will tell us, have never been a problem. Let me just go through the others real quickly. How about nuclear weapons? Well, I'll go into this more if you could, in the discussion period, but China is the only nuclear power to have issued a verifiable no first use pledge and has never threatened to use nuclear weapons in any circumstances, be the first to use nuclear weapons. I think I miswrote that. How about human rights? You know, the US leaders in Washington have weaponized human rights as a propaganda tool, but have never dealt with human rights within the city limits of Washington, D.C. So if they're really concerned about human rights, one would have to ask why. And we can go, we can't, there's also the cases of Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. And in a word, that's all bullshit. It's all CIA propaganda, but we don't have time to go into that either. How about ecology? China has planted more trees than any other nation, is involved with desertification. No. Planting grass in the deserts, getting rid of good deserts. They've been very involved with that. They make more electric cars, more electric solar panels than any other country. And how about those broken rice bowls? Well, we could go into that later if somebody wants to. Let me just conclude here and saying, well, again, as Marx said, defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, which we call socialism. They must be understood in this context. And we're not arguing that there are no problems. And China did not say it has no problems, but they're dealing with those. So again, refer to scientific socialism, that's the approach we need to adopt in looking at China. Let me move forward here just to say, put this in global perspective. I woke up rather late this morning, so didn't really have a chance to. But I want to talk a little bit about the let's go over here. Oh. Well, let me just say, the place China in the global sweep of humanity from the earliest times when we began as apes and transformed ourselves into humans, developed from ancestral communism into class rule and capitalism and globalism. Just want to, let me see if I can find that down here. Oh, yeah. Nope. Nope. Here's what the Communist Manifesto says about the future. There's a long quote here, but in the course of development, when class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. If the proletariat during its contest with the bourgeoisie is compelled by the force of circumstance to organize itself as a class, if by means of a revolution it makes itself the ruling class as such, it sweeps away the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of all classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. In the place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we will have I apologize for this. We will have an associate. Yeah, I have 2 more minutes. 2 more minutes.
Right.
In place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Well, let me just say, again, the same thing is said in Wiedemeyer and in Lewis Henry Morgan's work, which was quoted by Engels in in his book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. He says, he quotes Morgan saying, the future of our species, a property career is not the future of mankind. If it will be if progress will continue as it has in the past, it will be a return to the freedom, to the liberty, equality, and solidarity of the ancient commune. And that's what Morgan said. So again, if we put the People's Republic of China into the full sweep of history, we see that it is on the right direction. It is moving towards communism, but that is by no means over. And for us to get there, we will have to deal with our own capitalists in the United States. So I will end there. Thank everybody for listening. And I think we started late, so I did think I got in there an hour. But if people have questions, comments, disagreements, we can go into those. So back to you, Raj, or whoever's handling that.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Gene. We're gonna go to the questions and comment period. Gene, are there any announcements that you want to make before that?
Well, I already did announce that next week we will have Tony Ryan, who knows a lot about Cuba. He's been there many times. He's invited 2 people, which if you check our website, you can see the description there, the names of the 2 people. One is a graduate, an American graduate of a Cuban medical school practicing here, I think in San Francisco. And the other is a woman who has organized a lot of the medical exchanges. So that's going on. And I don't know if Richard wants to say anything about finances.
Richard Fallenbaum, do you have anything, any appeal to make here?
Nothing, we're still open to make a contribution to the library and to our weekly program. I think Gene will post on the chat some details, but it's also on the an email announcement.
Somebody else will have to do that.
Okay.
Okay.
So let's do that. I will actually go and ask people, if we normally have between 20 and 25, 20 to 30 people And so average is about 25 people. And we have to pay $75 for each session to the library, which we already paid through the end of the year. So on average, if everybody contributed $3 per session, that would be great, but that's average. We're not saying you have to do it, but keep that in mind. Some will pay more, some will less. So we suggest people pay per month between $10 and $20 a month. That would support us really nicely and be able to meet our obligation to the library. So with that, let's go to the question answer period. And Mehmet, could you keep time? And then please raise your hands, and I will recognize the hands and go sequentially as to who, as the hands are raised. So I noticed I haven't seen any hands yet. And do you need to have the slides up, or can we take the slides down?
You can take them down. I'm trying to figure out how to do that myself.
Okay.
Yes, I will be keeping time.
Okay. Stop.
Okay, very good. So I can see better. So I see a hand here of Steve. I think there's only one Steve. So Steve, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and you are the first one to go.
Go ahead, Steve.
Steve, your microphone is still off.
Okay, all right. Thank you for the program today. It was really good. You know, there's a lot of people out here in the United States and internationally that, you know, want to say China is this or is that. And I don't usually go for that stuff. Because I think China's made a great contribution to humanity. My question, though, is, I guess as far as readings that people can do to solidify what Gene was discussing, what would you suggest that a series of books or articles? Could you put something together and put on the chat, or maybe present it at some time, please? That would be very helpful.
Yes, thank you for that. I got confused while I was doing this, as you know. But at the end of my talk, and as I mentioned, I overslept and didn't have a chance to revise. But I do have, there are a number of very good things. The best book of all is still Fan Shen, A Documentary of Revolution by William Hinton. That gives the best idea of knowing what the revolution's all about, from within, so to speak. There's Martin Jacques, When China Rules the World. He was actually editor of New Left Review, I think. But he's got a lot of stuff on China. So Martin Jacques, J-A-Q-U-E-S.
Would you mind putting that on chat, Eugene, so everybody can get the name?
I can't, no, I do mind. If people want that information, I can email it to them.
Okay.
But I just can't, I'm having troubles here with...
Okay.
So what was
email it to me. Email it to me, Steve, okay?
Well, it will be on YouTube, so if you haven't noted it, you can see the YouTube. And
unfortunately, that part we didn't go over. I have a slide on it, but that will not be on YouTube. I can send the whole slide presentation, or just those suggested readings. I can
Thank
send
you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Michael Hoffman from Oakland, you're next. Please unmute yourself.
But there's a lot of good stuff, I want to say also. If you go to the Chinese sources, Chinese CGTN, Chinese Global Television Network, or China Daily, if you go to those sources, you see a lot of information that's very useful. You see various, these people are on there. There's also Zhang Weiwei does a lot of good stuff on China. He was Deng's interpreter, so he's very knowledgeable. And he's a very kindly gentleman, very Chinese guy, but very knowledgeable and provides a very good view. But I'll get those out and email them to anybody who asks. I can do that this afternoon. If you
Okay, Michael.
Thank you, Gene. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, and I appreciated your talk very much. I especially appreciated your bringing up the writer Li Jun. I did not know about him, and I will look into him. But I was surprised by one of the first things you said, and that is that when Stalin started imposing his will on the people of Russia, liberals and democratic socialists went away from support of the Soviet Union. And I remember you said liberals, democratic socialists turned into even Trotskyists or worse. And I remark on that term because I think there are Trotskyists in this audience that might have thought, what is he talking about when you said that? But anyways, that's an aside. I think it's true that China plays a peaceful role in the world and that China has brought up millions, actually 1 billion people out of poverty. China, I believe, is now 1.4 billion people. So 1 billion people have been brought out of poverty in China. So it's definitely not a capitalist country. However, even though the Chinese Communist Party's constitution guarantees democratic rights, the reality in Xinjiang is very different, and there is massive racist oppression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. You say it's capitalist propaganda, but I do not believe that at all. I think that is a reality, just as real as Stalin's brutal suppression of the peasantry in total, not just the kulaks, happened in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. You quoted Mao as saying that the country was still state capitalist about 1/3, but under communist control.
It's
and the CPC,
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
And yes, thank you. And the CPC under Xinjiang has said that China will be completely socialist, but not even communist, only in 2050. Today, not 1/3 of the economy is controlled by capitalists, but 40% is controlled by international imperialism. 6% of the Chinese people are members of the CPC. That's over 80 million people. But many millionaires and even some billionaires are connected to the CPC leadership. So my point is, just as dialectical materialism understands the transformation of quantitative change into qualitative change, is it not possible to have the CPC be transformed into a capitalist party, but with Marxist sloganeering? That's it. Thank you.
Okay, Gene, you want to respond to that, I'm sure.
Yeah, let me just comment on 2 parts. First of all, with Stalin and the Soviet Union, getting along with Trotskyists has never been a major objective of my life. So I'll just if we want to go into that further about Trotsky, we can. And we've done that a lot already. In terms of Stalin imposing his brutal will on people, again, Stalin, that period in the 20s and 30s was a very harsh period because there was an intense class struggle. People, there was the White Terror, there was the Nazi invasion, and all of these other things. And Stalin understood the necessity to do what had to be done, take very harsh measures. But he had the overwhelming support of the Soviet people. If he didn't, those could not have happened. And we can go over that. And I Raj is here, has more detailed knowledge of that than I do, as does our comrade in Montclair, New Jersey, Grover Furr, and so forth. And that's an ongoing debate. And I think I'm really happy. One of the things about our library is that is a debate. People just don't assume that everything people say about Stalin is true, because it's not. And the same is true in Xinjiang. In the case of Xinjiang, there was real terrorism going on in Xinjiang with the Uyghur people, with some people who were Uyghurs. And there were people, terrorist attacks not only in Maji, I think it's called, in Xinjiang, but in Beijing, dozens of people were killed by these terrorist attacks. And China took effective action in terms of controlling its border. I mean, there were people who believe, and the National Endowment for Humanities, actually, when they give money to Xinjiang, they call it East Turkestan. And that is kind of like, kind of like the Confederate States of America, in terms of. So I just think we need to understand that and read the Chinese sources on these and listen to people who have been to China. And we will have a session at, well, anyway, there's some other good stuff that's out floating around the web, correcting the misconceptions people have about Xinjiang. And you can either do one thing. You can listen to Pompeo about this, or who is a known liar, confesses to that. Or you can take the word of what the Chinese people are saying, the Chinese sources are saying, and then evaluate these 2 points and see which is better.
Okay,
I'd like to make some comments on this. This is Gary.
Yeah,
okay, you want to comment first, but Norma's hand is up.
Okay, Norma should speak first.
Okay.
No, Gary speak first.
Okay, Gary, you go first. Norma is yielded.
Yeah, I'd like to make two comments about the Ukraine 1929 to 1933 and the Great Leap Forward of the late 1950s, early 60s. Both of these things have in common that they took place in territories that are noted sharply and clearly for their, for the famines that were taking place that wiped out millions of people at a stretch. And these were natural phenomena. These did not need any help from Stalin or the Bolshevik Party or anybody else to wipe out people. That was ongoing at the time that Stalin made the decision that farming in the Ukraine and that part of Russia was going to have to be collectivized in order to take the profits from those crops and pay for some heavy machinery that was badly needed to industrialize the first 5-year plan. In the case of China, there was a mistake made by the Chinese party, and it actually wasn't on Mao that this happened. This actually happened with Liu Shaoqi and his understudy Deng Xiaoping. And they figured that they could bring China into the 20th century very rapidly by doing certain things to jack up the production of the agricultural sector, and it didn't work. And they kept telling Mao that things were just going hunky-dory, when in actuality the opposite was the case. And as a result, there was a disaster that lasted for about 4 or 5 years, and the jury is out as to how many people actually died of famine and starvation and stuff like that. But it was pretty bad, but they also recovered rapidly. I mean, that's all I have to say about those things. It's not a simple question of blaming the Communist Party here or the Bolsheviks there for people starving to death.
Okay, Norma, please go.
Hi. Grover does a.
Step out for a minute, Mehmet, to please.
Okay. Grover does a nice commentary about famine in the communist struggling states. In particular, he's dealing with Russia. Famine was the beginning of the revolution. It wasn't caused by the revolution. It was corrected by the revolution ultimately. And that's one of the things about China's persistence in protecting against counter-revolution, like what the Uyghurs have been promoting, actually, and Hong Kong, for example. The other thing that helps my heart cockles, warms the cockles of my heart. Some years ago in Monthly Review, there was a review of publications by Minqi Li, Minqili. I'm sorry, I don't have the details. He is, as an author, he's been teaching at Utah University, talking about how good the Cultural Revolution was for the people. And I have since heard other people who have experienced the Cultural Revolution also saying that kind of a thing. You remember the idea was to be able to let people who had the privileged position of playing the violin as stars and so forth go to places where they would actually produce products for people's use, like corn. And this was, it takes so much to get accustomed to the idea that the star that gets elevated to privileged observance position has to be among the people. In fact, we're still calling people who do thinking together intellectuals instead of the people.
2 minutes.
Okay, so Gene, you want to respond to that, or shall we go to the next person?
No, we can move on. I do have some comments, but let me just postpone that a little bit.
Okay, Richard.
Again, I appreciate this group at the Marxist Library has had a very fertile discussion on things about the Soviet Union and so forth. And so, and I know we have a lot of people who've gone over these things a lot. I'm particularly interested in China and the discussion of China.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Stay with China. As much
that would be my preference.
Well, the Cultural Revolution was in China.
That's right.
Richard, your comments, please, or questions?
Well, yeah, one comment and one question. I think I agree that China is the sort of center of the socialist camp, but I think the definition of what constitutes the socialist camp, Gene's definition, is a little bit limited. I think it's clear that the China and Russia, for example, are intimately intertwined in their policies and societies, and that China is an important source of support for Russia, and Russia is a important source of support and defense for China. And there's some talk about Iran being a part of this complex. And I think we have to look at it. I think we have to look at this concept of the socialist camp in a much broader way than we have up to now. And deeper theoretical way. It's clear that there are two camps in the world: the imperialist camp led by the United States and the socialist or anti-imperialist camp led by China. And we have to take account of all the members of that group and that the boundaries are fluid, and we have to take account of it. Secondly, I'd like to ask Gene on his reaction, any comments or anybody else about the recent statements by speeches by Pompeo and Barr, which were extremely anti-Chinese and particularly singled out what they call the Chinese Communist Party. They don't even give it the right name, but they only refer to China as the Chinese Communist Party. I've been thinking that a good example, you could refer to the United States as the American Capitalist Party too, and that would be maybe any rate. That's all I want to say. So one comment and one question.
Gene, you want to respond?
Yeah, well, just a little bit. Again, I think it's important to understand that in calling China and recognizing China as a socialist country doesn't mean we agree with everything they do. And doesn't mean that there aren't deeply troubling things. For example, the breaking of the iron rice bowl. A lot of us were very concerned about this. But on the other hand, there are reasons why China did this. One has to understand why they had to do this in order to liberate the forces in the long. And we, I think a lot of us in the left, talk about, well, the Mao years, they were doing all these great things with the commune and so forth. And then Deng Xiaoping changed it into a consumerist society and so forth. Well, that may be true, but we tend to have a romantic view of that. And, there's a very good argument that, well, China could see, Chinese people could see that Chinese overseas were doing very well with capitalism. And they weren't all that happy with things there, so that they had to make certain kinds of adjustments. They had to do these things, but they've never said that everything they do is correct. They freely admit all the kinds of mistakes that they've made. So it's not that they cover these things up. But the other thing is, in terms of the Cultural Revolution, there are different views on this, just as there are on the Great Leap Forward, and I'm not sure I agree with Gary's statistics on that. But Xi Jinping was one of those that was sent out to the countryside and spent 10 years herding pigs in the countryside, and a lot of time reading also. But he credits his success. He is what he is today because of the Cultural Revolution. That's what made him a communist. So I just want to think, we ought to take a look at these things from the Chinese point of view and understand what they're saying. That doesn't mean that everything they're saying is wrong. I mean, if one say preferences, I think Cuba is doing are really cool. A lot of great stuff in terms of medical internationalism and so forth. China's also doing a lot of that too. But, also if you look at China, there's this rampant, consumerism, all kinds of stuff that they're doing in terms, so we need to, just because we understand that that's a socialist society doesn't mean we agree with everything they're doing. And it doesn't mean we would necessarily like to live there rather than being, a comfortable middle-income professor here in the United States. So I'm just saying we need to put this into perspective. But the last thing I want to say is that we have introduced a resolution for the National Veterans for Peace Convention, which is the first week of August. And that resolution is titled Pivot to Peace with China and the World, and recognizing the central role that this has. And we're doing a seminar on that. There have been a number of other seminars floating around, and I'll include that in any list that people's references to some of these webinars that are very convincing. And you need to look at those webinars before you complain about, oh, they're being so brutal to the Uyghurs. Oh, those nice Hong Kong kids are being so maltreated. That's nonsense.
Okay, so Michael Kaufman has raised his hand. Before I go to him, I want to ask others, and in particular, since we have one very recognized Trotskyist among us, Elazar, our old friend, since you have talked about Trotskyist and Trotskyism, does Elazar wants to make a comment before Michael K comes on, or say something, Elazar? Okay, so we'll wait for Elazar if he wants to speak.
Elazar is my comrade, and we're good friends, and we talk a lot. So we've discussed.
I know. I'm just giving him a chance because since you talked about.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, so Michael, since there's nobody else, go ahead. You
And
can
then Gary.
Yeah, Gary.
Yes,
Gary, wait.
After Michael.
Yeah.
And also, I had, texted you, Raj. Thanks.
Okay, you want to speak after that? Okay, fine. So Michael, you go next. Gary next. After that, Mehmet.
I just want to reiterate the last part of my statement earlier in our meeting about the transformation of Chinese economy into a capitalist economy and the transformation of the Chinese Communist Party into perhaps a capitalist party. I think the party question may be problematic, but the economy certainly is not. The economy certainly is growing and growing in terms of imperialist control of major industries in China. That's all I wanted to say, and see whether anybody wants to comment on the Chinese economy. Thank you.
Yeah, Michael, I'll start with that, taking it from the bottom.
Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
I think there's been state capitalism in China since 1949, and yes, it's true that it's grown and it's expanded. The question is, does it control? And what classes are always under control of whatever the economic arrangement is? And it's there that I think we would have disagreements. I actually think there is communist socialist control of that capitalist segment. That's point one. Point two, this was something earlier. I don't think that I think there's a difference between having a socialist camp and individual socialist states having their own arrangements with other countries. For example, BRICS is not a socialist camp arrangement. There are at least 5 different forms of economic social orders involved there. And the fact that you have 5 countries that are socialist doesn't mean that they constitute a camp, because they don't have the kinds of relationships that existed during the Comintern, or even during the meetings of the of the socialist bloc during the 50s and 60s, the international conferences that took place during that time. I mean, I think those are things that need to be taken into account. As far as again, whether or not what's going on with China and Pompeo and the United States, I would actually suggest that we read thoroughly the two, on a constant basis, the 2 alleged mouthpieces of communism and capitalism, respectively. And that is the Global Times and the South China Morning Post. Both of them have come up with some very interesting arguments and editorial items and stuff to look at around this business. And by the way,
2 minutes.
as of this morning, Chengdu, the U.S. consulate in Chengdu was shut down by the Chinese government.
Okay. You done, Gary?
I'm done.
Okay, I have Dave Dhanua as next person. Dave, go ahead, please.
Oh, Eugene, I just wanted to know that what are the socialist mode of production in China at the moment, in what sectors you can see in agriculture and industry, you know, because that's what will show whether it's a socialist country or not. I don't know, I may be wrong, but at least I would like to know.
You get the question, Gene?
Yeah, I don't think I can give a good answer in terms of, I haven't studied the socialist economy well. I've read a number of pieces of work on that, and some of the sources I'll cite do go over that. And I think the commanding heights are socially owned, basically. But I can only give a general answer. I can't answer that in particular. And if you have information on that, I'd be very pleased to see it. So thank you for the comment. And I wish I knew more about that. And other people do know more than I do about it. So
okay, I have another person, which is Richard. Richard, go ahead. Johnson, Richard Johnson.
It's Kit. Hi, it's Kit.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. I have a quick question about the voting process. We know that in the U.S. we have a pseudo-democratic process here that, is up for, question what's going to happen this November. But how do they vote in China? What's their process? I've heard how Cuba does it. So how do they do it there?
again,
Yeah, I can do that. First of all, they have local elections at the village level to elect the political leadership of that village, and those folks are not necessarily all communists.
Isn't that like Cuba?
Not quite. Because of the differences, one moves up the ladder. In China, the folks are not so much elected as they are groomed, so to speak, for leadership. If you're in the government or if you're in the party, you pass a civil service exam. If you pass a civil service exam, you get recruited at a lower level, and for years on end, you get sent to this, that, and the other assignment that can range from governorships in the countryside to mayoralties in the cities to positions in the foreign ministry overseas. There's endless things, but the whole purpose is to give people experience in and test what their strengths and weaknesses are in order to move up to the next level, or not to move to the next level, depending on how they perform. And ultimately, you get a group of folks that literally are groomed but rise to the top, where they become part of the political bureau or they become part of the central committee. That's how it works. That's how it works in China. It's a variation on, it's a mass proletarian variation on what used to take place during the time of the emperors. I'd also like to add that the relationship of the capitalist class in China is also a variation on what used to take place in the time of the emperors. The Chinese capitalists may be doing a lot of business, but in relationship to the party, like that of the emperors before them, the party gives commands to these folks and they do what they're told. That's all I got to say.
Okay. Thank you. Gene, you want to add something to it?
Yeah, I do want to say some things here. In general, that's true, but I think there's, first of all, there are elections, I believe, every 2 years in China where they elect the local level. Then that level elects people to the provincial level. Then there's another level. And then there are like 3 or 4 levels in which the basic level elects the bodies at the next level, that level elects the next level, and so forth. And that is the people's vote. And people are free to vote however they want to. And if you look in Wikipedia, there are the results of various elections. And generally the elections going up there and for particular issues, they run to 80 to 90% generally supporting the position, but there are always people who vote differently and so forth. So that's part of that. And that's the way people are elected into public office and so on. But then, as Gary said, it's different within the party. You get promoted within the party, and that's all determined inside the party. They don't go out and say, well, do you think Trump should be the, leader of the Republican Party? They don't do that. The party determines who's going to move forward. They have an extensive body, and I forget the name of it, that basically reviews everybody, fills out a spreadsheet on everybody. Zhang Weiwei, the guy that Mao's Deng's interpreter, has an extensive discussion of this, how each level people are tested, evaluated, and then that determines how they move up. And there's a chart there that shows, okay, there are 90 million members of the Communist Party. Only about like 200,000 are up at the next level of the party, and then only about 100,000 are up above there. And then you go up the level, and very intensive, meritocratic, going back to the Han Dynasty in China, that make it up to the top. So by the time Xi Jinping was selected, he had already been governing a province that was the size of Germany. So he was already an expert. And so there are these ways, and that is why it is so effective, but it is also popularly supported. And I also wanted to say something, like Yogi Berra, I'm very reluctant to make predictions, especially about the future. And what's going to happen in China is difficult to say, but I don't see any reason to think it's going to transform itself into a capitalist society. I mean, you look at the controls, you look at what's happening, you look at the support, and basically they're doing well. I mean, why would they overthrow this government and this system that's, lifted a billion people out of poverty, and people are improving themselves, doubling their income every year, or not quite that, but, huge increases. They see China is highly thought of around the world. So I think one needs to bear in mind, I don't see any reason to think that China could be overthrown. But I didn't see any reason to think that the Soviet Union would be overthrown back in the 1980s either. So,
okay, who else wants to come in at this point? Mehmet, you were going to speak one time, and what happened to it?
Well, we can do it now. Now, I'd like to pick up on the issue of Uyghurs, and this has nothing to do with discussing whether China is socialist or not. But we have to be very, very, very careful when we disseminate, information that has been generated by CIA and the NED. The entire information on Uyghurs that we hear in the mainstream media comes from just 2 organizations, and both of them have been created by CIA, Radio Free Asia and the Uyghur World Congress. Their leaders are very, very closely tied to the US, the foreign affairs, and also to the fascist parties in Turkey. Its founder, Aytekin, has found refuge in Turkey under the auspices of the fascist party, the National Movement Party, whose head was the NATO's intelligence officer in Turkey. So these are the people who give the information that millions and millions of Uyghurs are under, I don't know, they say camps or things like that. But do you know how many people they interviewed to come up with these millions of people? Let me count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They talked to 8 Uyghurs and they put this into an algorithm. They had their formulas, and from talking to 8 Uyghurs alone, now we have this information floating all over the world that millions of Uyghurs are in concentration camps. That's all I'm gonna say. The money comes in from CIA, from NED, from Radio Free Asia, and this and that. But follow the money and see where it goes. And the type of work that these people do is actually scary, that this rumors or just made up things are floating around as if they are the truth. And it's part of the, of course, the capitalist, imperialist propaganda. Let's begin. Oh, by the way, in Syria today, the foreign fighters that try to bring a jihadist system to Syria under the auspices of Turkey, 30% of them are Uyghurs, and now those Uyghur fighters are divided. Some of them are sent to Libya to fight under, again, Turkish auspices, and the other have been sent to Azerbaijan because there is conflict coming up with Azerbaijan and Armenia. So now they will be fighting there. So Turkey is not an innocent player here. It's a NATO member. It is the arm that the US uses to go into China. There's a lot more to say. I posted the Gray Zone article. Please go and read that. Thank you.
Okay, so Rich Johnson has something to say. Rich, you're next.
Oh.
Can I jump in for just 1 minute?
Yeah, sorry.
And say, there is an excellent Uyghur restaurant in Union City. And it's definitely worthwhile going down there, and you get a real feel for whether the really, people are what they eat. So go down there. I forget the name of it, but look, just Google Uyghur restaurant. And there's not a lot of them in the Bay Area, but there is one in Union City. Wonderful food.
Okay.
Wonderful people.
So, Rich, you had Rich Kit.
It's just Kit. I just want to thank you for the answers. And actually, Mehmet read my mind, so I didn't ask it. So he did answer that question as well in my head. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, Sharon, you have a...
Finally.
Sorry.
Thank you. I just wanted to underscore something that Eugene said in his presentation when he quoted Stalin on the basic underlying law of socialism. I think we need to remind ourselves of an enormous transformation that happened in China in 2 or 3 generations. Stalin said that socialism is defined by meeting a society that meets the ever-rising material and cultural requirements of the people. I find a lot of Americans I talk to are dismissive of the meaning of bringing 1 billion people out of poverty over a few generations. What did it consist of? Well, maybe first it just the requirement was to have indoor plumbing. Maybe then a new requirement came, maybe getting education to all the people. And maybe then it was healthcare available to everyone. I think that we need to think about that. I'm always fascinated, I've been fascinated by the question of what does it take to have people rise up and risk their own lives and the lives of their families and children, and risk everything for the future. It takes a lot. It doesn't happen easily. And the Chinese people remember very well everything they sacrificed. The enormous sacrifice fighting against the Japanese invaders and occupiers, and the enormous sacrifice of continuing the revolution to victory in 1949. Many, many people who live in cities now in China don't know where their families originated because of the enormous upheaval of the 1930s and 40s.
2 minutes.
And I think we have to realize that they are not going to give up that revolution very easily.
Okay, so Michael Kaufman is next, but Jean, do you want to respond to what the comment was made by Sharon?
Raj, if my hand was up, it was by mistake, and I have nothing more to say.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go unless somebody else wants to go for it. Jean, you want to comment on what Sharon said?
I just want to thank Sharon for that comment. It's absolutely true. We need to see what is being done for the people. And, you know, here in America, we can't even raise our own people out of poverty. Just take a drive down Adeline Avenue in Oakland and see what poverty looks like in the United States. So again, socialism works for the people, and it has tremendously benefited people. I think we need to understand it's good for people. It's good for humanity. Not to say it's perfect, not to say, you know, they don't make mistakes, but they basically do the right thing, and they are supported by the people. But thank you, Sharon.
So, okay, I would like to make some comments and observations. I think it has to be acknowledged that Chinese Revolution is a great revolution. And one of its major accomplishments was to overthrow feudal culture, feudalism, feudal culture, etc., unify the people and move forward. They made mistakes, as all revolutions do. But I disagree with Jean about, and I agree more with Michael Kaufman, that what is developing in China is not socialism. Now, they made a deal with the United States. Both imperialist countries and China made a deal. And the deal was the production of commodities will, in a big way, shift to China. What that did was undermine the working class of the United States and other imperialist countries, lowered their wages. And in China, the wages were very, very low. And that capital, the Chinese Communist Party used to create a capitalism inside China, controlled by them, of course. And so it's a very interesting state of affairs in China, where Chinese Communist Party is definitely in charge of the country. And it's true, they have lowered the accomplishment is they have lowered poverty rate. If you compare India and China, there's no, you know, it's a hugely better in China. But had that come to India, for example, the same deal, India was behind, and since the Chinese Communist Party allowed all kinds of practices which was abhorrent to the socialist society were permitted. Okay, neoliberal exploitation of labor, long hours, displaced people living in dormitories, they still do. Okay, so the idea that this is all being done under socialism and it's necessary, somehow it's a lineage line from Marx to Engels to Lenin to Stalin and then to Mao to Deng. This is really, I think, a tremendous reach that you've
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay, just give me 1 more minute. I'll wrap.
Sure.
So what it is that Bukharin had an idea, which is if your party controls and the industrial production is in the hands of the working class, the vast peasantry can go on under the profit system. Okay, from Khrushchev introduced this idea. That's why it's Bukharin to Khrushchev. Khrushchev said, okay, state is under their control, the Communist Party, and bring profit motive to increase efficiency. I think that's where it then goes to Deng. And I think we can give Deng some credit that economy grew. But to call it this some kind of mixing from Marx all the way down to Deng Xiaoping is I think it's kind of, to me, that is not correct, with all due respect, Gene. Okay. I'm done.
Okay. Well, let me just comment. I will stand by what I say, and I did not really expect you to agree with me, but I just wanted to put those ideas out. But again, I think we now have to say, well, gee, they've adopted, you know, they're becoming capitalists. Well, capitalism is working for the benefit. I mean, they realize you can't deal with all problems all at once. They have to develop production. So they need to, when they let these foreign corporations in, they don't just they have to share technology. The Chinese have to control things. So they understand these things are problems. And they work on these problems, but they don't solve the problems before they happen. So going through this problem, they understand the risks, the problems, and so forth involved in it. They also understand the benefits. They can't say, oh, we're just going to do it and we're not going to take any risks. If you're not going to take any risks, you're going to stay living in poverty for your life. So they take these risks. They understand the problems. When they see these things happening, you know, you don't see people jumping out of windows committing suicide in Apple factories anymore. That was 10 years ago. It no longer happens because the Chinese saw the problem and took care of it. And a lot of the people, you know, the migrant workers, if you read some of their histories, what they say was they went to into the cities, worked as, you know, these horrible labor conditions. They knew they had to do this to make money so that they can then accumulate enough money, go back to their village, invest in their farm, get married, do other kinds of things, build sorts of things. So there's a pathway that the migrant workers were using. It's not like they were forced into, you know, into camps. You know, like in capitalism developed, you know, children, you know, like 8 or 10 years old, were herded into the factories and worked to death in these satanic mills in Britain and the United States. In Soviet Union and in China, kids are sent to school to learn, to improve themselves. So I think one has to say, yes, there are all these problems this creates, but you can't make a revolution and not have problems. So they understand these problems and say, yes, but we need to develop production. That's the key thing. We need to learn from the capitalists how to do these productive techniques. But now you look at the wages in China, they are dramatically improving. The lowest, the lowest workers in China have increased their incomes 200%, according to the New York Times. So again, I think we have to stop saying, oh, well, they're becoming capitalists and so forth. I think that's nonsense, and I'll stand by my comments on that. And the other thing I just wanted to say.
I love the fact that you called what I said is nonsense. Okay, Dave, you're next.
Well, okay, but the last thing I want to say on that is this fellow, Lee, I forget his name, but he said, yeah, and he's a member of the Communist Party and so forth. He says, yes, you can rise, capitalists in China can join the Communist Party and become part of the upper class, but they can never become part of the ruling class. That is governed by the party itself, according to the principles Gary mentioned and I mentioned and so forth. It's under their control, and they're not about to become capitalist. If they are, I don't know. I haven't seen any evidence for that. And we seek truth from facts, not fears.
One thing, one more thing.
No, Gary, please hold off. You're not next in line. It's Dave. Then after that, Steve, then Gary.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Please, thanks for the discipline. Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to say that I'm still learning. So you have to excuse me if I say something wrong, but what I have been learning that the Marx characterized an era based on the mode of production. So like during Roman time, it was a slave mode of production. And the feudal mode of production started, took its beginnings within that slave mode of production, and then after a while it replaced the slave mode of production all over Europe. And similarly, the capitalist mode of production started growing within the feudal mode of production when the feudal society was still in power. And so my question is that, so if Marx says that the era is defined by its mode of production, and is China, when you say it's socialist, is there a socialist mode of production rising? Or, I mean, it looks like more like they're developing the capitalist system, even though it's under the guidance of the Workers' Party. But so I would like to know that what is their plan? Like, how is it the socialist mode of production, if it's not there now, how it's going to evolve? But that's what would define, you know, like if that is a socialist economy. Gene?
Yeah, thank you. And again, I wish I knew more in terms of the economics of that. Min-Chi Lee, that I quoted before, has a lot of data on that. He's a professional economist at Utah, I think. So yeah, I would look at him. But again, mode of production, well, we know that the capitalist mode of production, what Marx called the absolute law of capitalist accumulation and so forth. And so that's operative in capitalism. However, as Stalin says, the socialist law of development of socialism, or I would say that's the socialist mode of production. And it's fundamentally different from capitalism. It improves the well-being of the people. And that doesn't mean that, you know, they go out and kill all the capitalists. And if you look at the Communist Manifesto, you know, in the Communist Manifesto, they say at a certain point, members of the old ruling class are going to desert their class and join the revolutionary movement because they can see the forward progress of humanity. And I would say that lies with China, not with imperialism, not with capitalism. And they may use capitalism, but it's under their control. And so I'd say the basic mode of production in China is socialist, not capitalist. But Steve, other people may have other views.
Yeah. Steve, you're next. Please unmute yourself. Steve? Yeah, go ahead.
I know that a few months ago, there was a story being circulated on the internet. I pay attention to it because I wanted to see how it was going to be resolved. It involved a situation in a Chinese area, an area in China, where Africans there was an accusation that Africans were being not allowed to go to McDonald's because there was a fear they had coronavirus. And I liked how the Nigerian, a couple other embassies got together with the Chinese Foreign Ministry and kind of worked this out, because something did happen. And the government apologized for it. And kind of said it wouldn't happen again. There was some misunderstandings about some lockdowns and people being put on quarantine and this kind of thing. But at least there was an acknowledgement that an error was made and that it needed to be learned from. And with all the blood on the hands of Trump and governors from Newsom to whoever is the governor where you live, no one's apologized for anything here. I'm not saying that they're the good guys because they apologized, but the fact that they confronted an issue that was being used, I think, by the CIA and Voice of America to destabilize their image among Africans, they addressed it head on. And we can't get that kind of stuff, that kind of action by capitalist politicians. It just doesn't happen. And that's
okay,
it.
Richard Fallenbaum is next. And then the phone number, which ends in 9307. I don't know who that is.
Mark, it's not just that they apologize, but they took action to correct the situation. I think that's crucial. And thank you for that.
Okay. So,
yeah, the first thing I want to mention, Steve, because I want to thank him for his contribution.
Sorry, you're muted. No, we're muted. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, my mistake.
Okay. I just want to thank Steve for his financial contribution. I was reminded, and it's been processed. And all the other ones. I think there's a very deep philosophical, theoretical issue involved here, and I think the development of the productive forces in the world means that we're in the age of the transition to socialism objectively. It's not a subjective matter, it's an objective matter. So all countries are in some sense in the transition to socialism to the extent that they have advanced productive capability, the socialized production. And this is in a way, in a global sense, an irreversible process. And it's not due to even, it's affected by the policies of governments and ruling classes to some extent, but it's an objective process. And even the United States is in the process of a transition to socialism. It's very weak, but the stresses on the capitalist system in the United States are so extreme now that either it's going to collapse or it's going to completely into chaos, or it'll transition to socialism. And even the attempt to reinstall capitalism in the Soviet Union and Russia failed. And in my view, is embarked again on socialism with Russian characteristics, if you will. And in every country where socialism was nominally overthrown, there's an enormous struggle going on. So I think we have to look at this. We have to look at the socialist sprouts in every country, the socialist, and look on the remnants of the old order as just that. They're remnants.
2 minutes.
So
okay, so I'll go to this phone number unless Gene, you have something to say to that.
I just want to thank Richard for that, and I think that's true. That's true. That we need to understand that there are these remnants that are still there, and the Russian Communist Party is pretty goddamn big, isn't it? In Russia, I mean, it's millions of people. I don't know. Yeah. So I thank you for that.
It's the leading opposition party.
Okay, so this phone number is next 9307. Sorry, I don't know your identity.
Yeah,
yes, it's David.
And you bumped me, Raj.
Yeah. Hey, David. Sorry. Who did I bump?
Gary.
Oh, Gary. My apology. Gary, you go after him, or you want to go first? Actually, I should go to Gary. Can you please hold?
That's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, Gary.
Okay. Sure. Couple of things. Around Steve's remarks about Guangzhou, which is where the racial stuff between the Africans and the Chinese happened. The Chinese not only apologized, they did take steps to, to deal with not only that immediate situation, but what was going on in terms of racial dynamics in that city for several years that actually gave rise to that particular incident that our attention was drawn to in March and April. And the authorities in Guangzhou have actually been dealing with that on a regular basis. I mean, I actually monitor that on several different sources. Secondly, this is for Raj. You talked about Bukharin and some ideas he had in the late 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
Be careful. They find their highest expression in the Solidarność movement of the 1970s led by Lech Walesa. And we saw what happened with that.
Did I praise it? Did I praise Bukharin?
Yes, they did.
No, I said Bukharin's line is what runs through Bukharin, Khrushchev, and then on to Deng. That's what I
right.
said.
And that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it started with Bukharin, but it winds up in Poland in 1979, in a country where 13%.
I don't understand the connection. I don't understand the connection of what I said with what you're saying.
What I'm saying is that
something which I did not say.
Well, what were you saying then?
I'm saying the idea that capitalism under a communist party rule can lead to socialism is Bukharin's idea. That's also the idea of essentially Khrushchev, who started to introduce profit motive. And
right,
that's
and what I'm arguing is that idea of Bukharin and Khrushchev found its expression in the Solidarność movement in the 70s.
Well,
which is what happened.
That's a reactionary movement. The two I'm saying is the father of that idea is Bukharin, what Deng eventually practices successfully this time, because the international situation has changed. That's what I said. But I don't want to argue with you. My role is that of a moderator, so go ahead, finish your thought. But since you said my point was leading to support of Solidarność, that I object to.
No, I'm saying that I'm not saying you're supportive of Solidarność. I'm saying that Bukharin's theory, as adopted by Khrushchev, led to the Solidarność in 1979, and this can be proven, by the way.
Okay, we'll take your opinion for that. I will not get into this discussion. So now go to the numbers 9307, please. You're next.
Yes, hi, it's David. Thanks, Raj, and thanks, Gene, for your presentation today. It's good to hear everyone on the call. I'm recalling a quote or a phrase I heard some time ago, and it might have been on this very call, but I'll share it all the same, and that is that the U.S. and China are doomed to compete. And I thought that was an interesting expression. The doomed part sort of frames it negatively, but maybe that's just also a competition, a reality of international competition. But I'm wondering, I'm sort of combining that with the thought also we've heard, or the notion that for some decades, maybe post-World War, that America has been known as the indispensable nation. And I think we see that shifting, if not rapidly, towards China. And I'm just wondering what that transition sort of balance of power looks like, if it's indeed true that we'll always be doomed to compete, or can we, maybe when there's a new balance of power, that we will learn to cooperate? That's the general question and framing, if anyone has comment. I guess maybe Gene first.
Well, I just want to remark on that. One of the things, I try to read the left press, but I also read the bourgeois press, especially Wall Street's think tank, the Council on Foreign Relations. And you look through that, there's a lot of stuff in there saying United States is no longer the world leader. That's disappeared. You know, we have lost leadership. They're complaining about this. So they understand, and they're complaining, well, China's putting forth this new idea about win-win policies. You know, what kind of thing is that? You know, so there is a transition going on. I think it is a global transition, and I think China's going to win. That's all.
Okay, so I also made to make a comment on that, but I want to give others first chance. But on that subject, I want to say something.
I'm beginning to call the decline of the United States and Britain and the other three Five Eyes economies, all English speaking, by the way. I'm beginning to conceptualize them as the second century of humiliation.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, 90. Anybody else who wants to say something on it before I make a comment? Others should get a chance first.
Yeah, I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, what about this information coming out that China is setting up a very, very extensive surveillance system consisting of face recognition, the DNA being collected from all males in China, and it's setting up this. And by the way, a lot of this technology is being supplied by Western countries to put the whole population under intense surveillance. I hope that's. What's your reaction to that? Because it doesn't sound like it's going to be a socialist paradise if everybody is under intense surveillance, and just like over here, we don't want everybody to be under intense surveillance. What's your reaction to that, Gene?
Yeah, I want to remark on that because, again, the Chinese are not saying we should do that. We're not saying we may not want that here. But what do the Chinese people think about that? And there's been a lot of discussion of this in the Chinese press and elsewhere, saying they welcome this. They welcome the fact that all their, they can go to WeChat or Alibaba and, they can just go to a restaurant online and order what they want. And they already know what they want because they have their past records. And the interviewer was saying, well, God, that's horrible. Do you like that? Do you want the state might get that? And the response is, they already have it. What's the big deal? Well, aren't you worried about that? It says, no, why should I worry? I'm not doing anything wrong. Only people who need to worry are people doing the wrong.
That's what people say in the United States when they give up their freedom.
Can I finish? That's our view in the United States. The Chinese do not necessarily share that view. And the Chinese would greatly prefer to have, a secure society in which their rights are protected, rather than here in the United States, where we have no protection whatsoever against vandals and state violence and all this sort of thing.
Okay. You don't see a downside to that? Do you see a downside to that at all in terms of individual freedom? Or maybe that's not in their value system.
Octave, this is Gary. In order to lose the individual freedom, you first have to have it in the first place.
Okay.
We don't have it here.
I would agree with that.
It's a moot point.
Okay, thank you.
Again, I think we need to look at it through different eyes.
Okay.
And again, you can't lose something you don't have.
Okay, your point is well taken.
Okay, so the question about peaceful coexistence between, David raised this point between emerging China and declining imperialist camp of the West, led by the United States. I think I personally consider China as an emerging capitalist power. It is second only to the United States. It's still, in terms of size, smaller, but it is well managed by the Communist Party. Capitalism today cannot function like it was set up to function in the United States. And I agree with Richard Fallenbaum that there is a crisis here, and capitalism in crisis. And that's why they went to China in the first place. And if you want to study what Lenin said, imperialism, the highest stage, explains that to you. But Lenin also said, politics is concentrated economics. And if the economics is capitalist economics in China, which is what it is substantially, then politics cannot vary from it for too long. And the idea that in 2050, China will turn around and now have socialism. There is no comparison with the development of China, with the development of Soviet Union under Stalin's leadership, and even later on Khrushchev's, which was changing, but substantially that period of development is different. Now, if we agree that that was a failure, and socialism cannot be built except going through capitalism, then everything China is doing is correct. But anybody who has seriously read Marx and Lenin and Engels and Stalin cannot say that. This is a tremendous leap Gene has taken today to unify all that and justify what's going on in China. At least that's how it appears to me. Gene, go ahead.
Well, there is another Marxist theorist who said, It doesn't make any difference whether it's a white cat or a black cat, as long as it catches mice. And I'm not saying this as some kind of general principle, but again, we need to seek truth from facts. And so if we want to know what's going on in China, well, yeah, we need to read Lenin and so forth, but we need to deal with facts, which are actually going on. And the fact is, the Chinese people have tremendously improved themselves. And that's not the way capitalism works. It's not the way capitalism works. So you're saying it's capitalism, and I say, no, it's not. We need to seek truth from facts. Are the Chinese people benefiting under this system? And again, I read what the Chinese people have to say, what the Chinese are doing and so forth. What is their view of their world? And I think their view of the world is correct, much more correct than any other view. But again, we need to cross the river by feeling the stones.
Yeah, Gene, in the 80s, I used to have a poster from Fifth Estate in Detroit. It was an alternative newspaper. And on the right side of the poster, it had Deng Xiaoping with that cats and mice quotation. And on the left side, it had Garfield Cat stating, "Good mousers invariably have bad breath."
So how is that different than Republican parties saying a rising tide lifts all boats? Isn't that saying the same thing?
That wasn't the Republicans that said that. That was the Democrats.
Okay, no, but I mean, there's a Republican Party that says that a rising tide lifts all boats. That's what I recall. You may have different recollection on it. But this is...
No, it was the Democrats that said it, but it originated with Booker T. Washington.
Gary, let's go to the substance of it, not okay?
That's the mantra. That's the mantra of capitalism. That's saying the rich should spend their money so that we can have some of it.
That's right. I mean, this is increasing the productive forces argument is what Stalin argued against in his last writing. Gene, you have read that book, Economic Problems, Socialism. How can you quote?
Yeah, but I didn't take it seriously, you said.
Him. You're quoting Stalin against Stalin. You know, you're completely inverting Stalin in your argument that productive forces are the substance of socialism. They are not. That's a misleading thing. Go back and please read Stalin's last theoretical work.
Well, maybe we could put that as a group reading that the whole group should do. Yeah, just sit down and read Foundations of
No, the substance of that is that that was exactly what was being argued by people who later on supported Khrushchev. He died, and he had thrown that economist out. So the argument that productive forces lead you towards socialism, you are basically reducing Marx, Lenin, and Stalin into opposite of what they argued.
What is the argument? Wait a minute. What is the argument then, Raj, that disagrees with that says otherwise than that? Can you please tell me?
The argument is actually Mao tried to practice initially, honestly, that you should have a production that is controlled and for the benefit of the working class, not for a capitalist class that you'll say will tax them heavily.
Right. Okay.
The Democrats also say that we'll give everybody benefits. Okay.
Okay.
But it's the slavery which you argue against, right? Wage slavery. Where is this? And Gene says justifying wage slavery in defense of socialism. You're against that, Norma. And what I'm saying is, let us be honest and admit that socialism didn't work. If you want to say that, and the Chinese are practicing capitalism because socialism didn't work, that'll be a more honest argument rather than to defend it under socialism.
No, socialism is working. It's a developmental process. Sorry, Gary.
It's okay. Raj, in the late 1950s, Mao wrote a reply to the draft textbook that Stalin was critiquing in his economic problems. Mm-hmm. And that, I forget the title of the book, but it was published by Monthly Review Press in the late 60s.
Let me jump in for something. I may make a theoretical point.
What?
in it.
Before anybody speaks, let me say something. You know, guys, it's 12:57. Officially, we are gone. I overdid this by half an hour, but after 3 minutes, it's gonna be 1 o'clock. So let me just remind you.
Then, so let's have the final thoughts of whoever. Gene will get the final thoughts.
Okay, well, I
Who
want to.
was speaking just now, and let them finish their sentence? Was that Gary, or was that finished?
No, Gary was
I asked
finished.
Gary, what was the substance of Mao's critique?
Exactly what you were talking about, actually, Raj. I mean, I put it out there because I want to encourage you to go after that particular book.
So what I was arguing was consistent with what Mao said.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Gene, your final thoughts.
I just want to refer people to a theoretical paper I wrote back in 1975, which has escaped many people's attention, but it's titled Mode of Production and Mode of Exploitation. And it's a different interpretation of Marx. Marx did talk about the mode of production and so forth. That's absolutely true. But to elevate this way, some people, is a mechanistic interpretation of Marx. One can read other things in Marx where he talks about the way surplus is extracted. And on basis of these other quotations from Marx, I said there's a definite mode of exploitation which is semi-independent from the mode of production. And many people get confused on this because capitalism is simultaneously a mode of production and a mode of exploitation. But if you look at feudal society, like feudal Japan, there was a mode of production, but on top of that sat a mode of exploitation, which extracted surplus from the direct producers. So that is a dialectical interpretation of Marx to replace that mechanistic one. But that's a deep theoretical argument, which even I can't follow now. So anyway.
Just negated Marx against his entire work, Capital, by saying that.
Pardon?
I mean, you're making this fantastic statement that Marx argued against his entire book of Capital.
No, if you read Capital carefully, you'll come up with the same conclusion.
Gene, you've read it once. I have read it twice. What is care? What do we mean?
We both read Capital.
Are you in a position
you interpret it in one way. I
read
it a different
correct,
way.
Incorrect,
You interpret it mechanistically.
No, but what makes my reading mechanistic and yours organic?
I have an idea, Raj. Gene.
Yo.
That paper you wrote back in '75?
Yes.
Send it to us.
I will send a link to it in. If people, I promise to send out my sources, so I'll include that.
Okay.
But I'll also mention that the chat room is going to disappear. So
okay,
things in the chat room
I think
disappear.
We need to end the session. Thank you, Gene.
Thank you, Raj, and thank you, everybody.
It's been real.
The problem about the chat room is we have not been able to figure out. You all have got it set so that it doesn't do what other connections have done, which is permit copying and pasting for one, or permit saving the chat. So you all have to look into the way you connect and check with Zoom about how to do it the way you want.
Yeah, let me take a look at that one. I looked at it talking to you privately, but it looks like that option is not there. I don't know if it's with the new Zoom version, or did the setups change when we were doing
I have been able to copy and paste for the past recent, okay? I do a number of webinars with people, and I always need, well, not always, I need the chat now and then, and so I copy and paste it. And a lot of them have the option, there's a place where it says file, there's been an option with 3 little dots to save the chat, and there isn't one here.
Yeah, so I'm the host, and that option is not there. I'll take a look at it.
Right. Check with Zoom and see if they can help you.
Sure.
Okay. So
thank you, everybody.
Formally ended, Rao. I think we can turn off the camera.
Well, just tell people who are in Berkeley to sign my petition to get on the ballot in November.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
It's been a pleasure.
nice Sunday. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses, since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums. Please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.